Welcome to another episode of The Read Pile. I am today looking at The Walking Dead, specifically just Volume 1. I have actually up through Volume 7. Okay, let's start. So, if I ever get to rereading Invincible, which I intend to do at some point, you'll hear the story about how I needed to be convinced multiple times by multiple people to give that series a shot. Something similar happened with The Walking Dead, where I needed to be talked into it because I knew it existed. I knew a bunch of people were talking about it, people were raving about it, and I didn't care. I'm just not that into zombies. So I came to it a little bit later. I was initially, Dan and I both believe, reading his trades, and at some point I bought some of my own, but I was still borrowing his up through issue 100. So I read 1 through 100, and that's where I decided to stop. I did not buy any more. This is on the shelf right next to me, which is where most of my unknown, unread, undecided upon books are. And I was looking over there and I'm like, I can make a decision about 7 books. I can knock out 7 books right now. My intention was to just reread, and this is what I did. I just reread Volume 1 because that's the only Tony Moore issues. I am a fan of Tony Moore. I think I noticed him on Fear Agent, probably before I started Walking Dead. So I became a fan of Tony Moore, and I'm like, I can just reread Volume 1, just keep that, because it's before Charlie Adlard takes over. Nothing against Adlard, but I know that I'm never going to finish reading the series, and I can keep just one Tony Moore book on the shelf, pretend that's where the series ends, and get rid of all of the Adlard stuff. So I mentioned reading up through issue 100. At the death of Glenn, I'm like, I'm out. I'm done. I've put up with just what I perceived as unending misery for long enough. I'm not going to continue reading this. And it eventually ended abruptly because he was lying in the solicitations. But whatever. I still stand by that decision. I'm not going to finish reading The Walking Dead. I don't care enough. I don't need that much terrible stuff in my brain. So, I was thinking the plan was to reread Volume 1, to keep this, and I don't even know if I'm going to do that. I'm technically still undecided, but I am going to get rid of Volumes 2 through 7, all of these ones here. All of these will go in the to-go pile. I don't need this in my life anymore. So, Volume 1 kind of blows my mind in a couple of ways. One, it reminds me far more of the show than I was expecting. So I was watching the show for a few seasons, and this, I mean, they did a great adaptation, especially the first episode, the early episodes. But just him waking up in the hospital, all of this is great. I don't think this is Tony Moore's best work, but I still like it. I still like it a lot. This scene here, I mean, I will forever have that scene in my head from the show. And then he runs into Morgan. This is the first, I think, surprising thing is, so he runs into Morgan and Morgan's kid, whose name I can't remember. But it's right here. They're talking about staying in the house, and he says you can stay there as long as you don't put up a fight over the place. Rick, in these early issues, still thinks things are going to go back to normal, and it's crazy from an outsider's perspective, knowing how far the series goes and everything that happens, that early on he was optimistic and thinking things were going to go back to normal, and this is, long before he has the "We Are the Walking Dead" big head splash page moment. So yeah, this kind of blew my mind, and it contrasts later when he's talking with Shane, and Shane thinks about things going back to normal. I've got another bookmark here because one of my pet peeves tends to be when people are saying things out loud to inform the audience, when there should be thought bubbles. This here, I think, makes sense. So he has left, he says Kentucky, which I didn't remember that point either, but he's left Kentucky. He was in a car, actually. So he was in a car, and he was driving to Georgia, Atlanta specifically. He runs into this horse, and he has not seen people. It's really hard to tell time in this series. It's not like there are many references to it, but he drove in indeterminate amount of time in a car before the car runs out of gas, and then he takes this horse. So I'm just going to say it's been at least a day, probably multiple days, before he's seen anyone else. Morgan and Morgan's kid are the only two people he has seen alive up until this point, so it makes sense to me that he's saying all of this stuff out loud to a horse when he's just trying to stay sane, really. So that I enjoyed. And then this is another one of those moments that really brings me back to the show, is Rick and the horse walking into Atlanta, and then we run into Glenn for the first time. And Glenn, as soon as I see Glenn, I've got Stephen Yoon's voice in my head. He's just Stephen Yoon's phenomenal. Guys, just phenomenal. Anyway, so yeah, this scene, I'm gonna say iconic to me, at least. And then we get all the stuff at the camp, and we meet Dale and Andrea, and I forgot about Amy and Jim, and just, I mean, it's, Shane especially is one of those names, is one of those characters where all you have to say is the first name and people know who you're talking about. These characters are amazing. Anyway, so all of this stuff happens, we get some incredible art, and then the contrast I was talking about is Shane and Rick are absolutely in conflict in a number of ways. What annoys me a bit is how right Rick is about everything. Like, he doesn't seem to be wrong, at least in these early issues, about anything. Because Lori is giving him shit over training Carl to use a gun, which comes in handy. Rick's talking about moving camp, and Shane is vehemently against it, and he kind of explodes in a couple of different ways when Rick isn't even talking about it. It's pretty great. But Shane, the reason Shane doesn't want to move the camp is because he thinks the army, that the government is going to come swooping in, rescue all of them any day now. And Rick, just a couple of issues ago, was talking about similarly things going back to normal, and there's no transition for Rick from the mindset of thinking things are going to go back to normal to we need to take care of ourselves. And it would have been nice to see that transition actually take place before the confrontation with Shane, but it unfolds the way it unfolds. I enjoyed revisiting this. There's a lot of nostalgia built into this, and I enjoyed that, but I don't even know if I'm going to keep Volume 1. It's okay. It's okay. But it's also so heavy on Rick, and Rick is just... he's almost too good of a character. I don't know. So my intention was to reread Volume 1, to keep this, to get rid of the other 6 that I have. And at the moment, I don't even know if I'm keeping Volume 1. This might also wind up in the to-go pile, just because it was nice to revisit, but I don't know if I need to ever do it again. That's where I'm at with this.